I want you to imagine something. You reach into your coat pocket and discover a $20 bill you forgot was there. Notice how that feels. A small spark of pleasure, a tiny private windfall. Now imagine you reach into your other pocket and realize a $20 bill that was there this morning is gone. Notice how that feels. Same amount of money, but the two experiences are not equal, and they are not even close. Losing $20 is roughly twice as painful as finding $20 is pleasant. That imbalance, that strange, irrational asymmetry between gains and losses is hardwired into your brain, and it is quietly distorting almost every important decision you make. About money, about risk, about your career, your relationships, and your happiness. This is the second half of Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and it will show you just how deep the damage goes. This is Thinking Fast and Slow, Part 2. In Part 1, we met the two systems that run your mind. System 1, fast, automatic, and dangerously confident. System 2, slow, logical, and chronically lazy. We learned how the mental shortcuts they rely on, anchoring, availability, representativeness, produce predictable errors that hide in plain sight. But that was the foundation. What we are going to explore now are the consequences. What happens when those same mental patterns collide with the real world, with expert predictions that turn out to be worthless, with financial choices that violate basic logic, with the terrifying discovery that losing something hurts twice as much as gaining it feels good? And what happens when Kahneman turns his attention to the deepest question of all, whether you even know what makes you happy? Over the next hour, I will walk you through every major idea in the second half of this book. We will cover overconfidence and why experts know far less than they think they do. We will explore prospect theory, the discovery that earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize. We will see how tiny changes in the way a question is worded can flip your preferences upside down. And we will end with an idea that I think will stay with you long after this video is over. The unsettling possibility that there are two versions of you, and they disagree about what a good life looks like. Let us begin with a story about a company you already know, and why the story you think you know is almost certainly wrong. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Understanding. Two creative graduate students in the computer science department at Stanford University come up with a brilliant new way to search the internet. They seek funding, start a company, and make a series of decisions that all work out remarkably well. Within a few years, their company is one of the most valuable in the world. The two former students are among the richest people on the planet. That is the story of Google. And when you hear it, something happens in your mind. You nod. It makes sense. Of course Google succeeded. The founders were brilliant. The idea was revolutionary. The timing was perfect. You feel as though, given all the pieces, you could almost have predicted the outcome yourself. Kahneman says this feeling is an illusion, and it is one of the most dangerous illusions your mind produces. He calls it the narrative fallacy, a term he borrows from the trader and philosopher Nassim Taleb. We are compelled to construct simple, coherent stories about the past, stories with clear causes and logical progressions, stories in which talented people make smart decisions and success follows as a natural consequence. But these stories radically underestimate the role of luck and radically overestimate the role of skill. Consider a fact that rarely appears in the Google story. 1 year after founding the company, the two founders were willing to sell it for less than $1 million. The buyer said the price was too high. If that buyer had said yes, there would be no Google as we know it. The entire arc of technology history would be different because of one person's casual judgment about a price tag. When you hear that detail, it shifts the entire story. Suddenly, Google's success does not feel quite so inevitable. But here is the thing. You were not missing this fact a moment ago. You were not aware that anything was absent from your understanding. You had a complete, coherent story, and it felt perfectly adequate. Why CIAT? What you see is all there is. The narrative fallacy is reinforced by another phenomenon that Kahneman describes in vivid detail: hindsight bias. In the early 1970s, the psychologist Baruch Fischoff surveyed people before President Nixon's historic visits to China and Russia. He asked them to estimate the probability of various outcomes. Would Mao agree to meet Nixon? Would the United States grant diplomatic recognition to China? After Nixon returned and the outcomes were known, Fischoff went back to the same people. He asked them to recall the probabilities they had originally assigned. The results were clear and consistent. People remembered being far more confident about what actually happened than they had actually been. Events that occurred were recalled as having been likely all along. Events that did not occur were recalled as having always seemed improbable. They were not lying. They genuinely believed their own revised memories. The past had been quietly rewritten to make it consistent with what they now knew to be true. Kahneman argues that hindsight bias has devastating consequences, not because it distorts our memories of dinner party predictions, but because it distorts how we judge decision makers. When we evaluate a CEO, a general, a surgeon, or a politician, we judge them not by the quality of the process they followed, but by the outcome they produced. And we do this even when the outcome depended heavily on factors they could not have known or controlled. Imagine a physician who recommends a low-risk surgical procedure. Everything about the decision is sound. The evidence supports it. The probabilities favor a good outcome. Other doctors would have made the same call, but during surgery, an unpredictable complication arises and the patient dies. In hindsight, a jury reviewing the case will find it difficult not to see warning signs that were simply invisible at the time the decision was made. The terrible outcome makes the decision look reckless, even though it was perfectly reasonable. Kahneman calls this outcome bias, and it is closely related to hindsight. Good decisions can have bad outcomes. Bad decisions can have good outcomes, but our minds refuse to hold these ideas simultaneously. We need the story to be consistent. Good decisions should produce good results, and bad results must mean someone made a mistake. And this brings us to one of the most provocative claims in the entire book. What if the same bias, the same need for coherent stories, is distorting our understanding of business success itself? The business professor Philip Rosenzweig wrote a book called The Halo Effect that Kahneman admires greatly. Rosenzweig examined the cottage industry of business books that claim to identify the practices of highly successful companies. The most famous of these, Built to Last by Jim Collins, studied 18 pairs of companies, one successful, one less so, and identified the management practices that separated winners from losers. The conclusions were confident and specific. The winning companies had bold leadership, strong cultures, and visionary strategies. The losing companies lacked these qualities. The message was clear: follow these practices, and you too can build a great company. There is a devastating problem with this analysis. The researchers identified the winning and losing companies first, then looked backward for differences. But when you know which company succeeded, everything about that company looks like the reason for its success. The CEO appears visionary. The culture appears strong. The strategy appears bold. This is the halo effect operating at the corporate level. The glow of success illuminates everything the company did, and the shadow of failure darkens everything the loser touched. The test of a good explanation is not whether it makes sense in retrospect. Almost everything makes sense in retrospect. The test is whether it can predict the future. And on this criterion, the Built to Last analysis fails spectacularly. In the years following the study, the gap in performance between the visionary companies and their less successful comparisons shrank to nearly zero. The exceptional companies regressed to the mean, just as Kahneman's flight cadets had regressed after a good landing. The core of the illusion of understanding is this: we believe the past makes sense because we construct stories that explain it, and we believe the future is predictable because those stories feel so solid, so complete, so obviously correct. But the stories are built from incomplete information, shaped by hindsight and polished by the halo effect. The world is far messier, far more random, and far less knowable than any of these stories suggest. And the people who are paid to make predictions about the future, the experts, the pundits, the analysts, are not exempt from this illusion. In fact, as Kahneman discovered, they may be its most spectacular victims. Chapter 2. The Confidence Problem. As a young lieutenant in the Israeli army, Daniel Kahneman was given a task that, looking back, he considers one of the most instructive failures of his life. He was assigned to evaluate candidates for officer training. The test worked like this. 8 soldiers who had never met were brought to an obstacle field. Their insignia were removed. They were given numbered tags and a simple challenge: get a long log over a 6-foot wall without anyone or the log touching the wall. If anyone made a mistake, the group had to start over. Kahneman and a colleague sat watching, taking notes. Within minutes, the soldiers' personalities seemed to reveal themselves with total clarity. One man took charge, another tried to lead and was brushed aside. Some were cooperative, others were stubborn or competitive. When someone's mistake forced a restart, you could see who responded with encouragement and who responded with blame. After several rounds, Kahneman and his colleagues sat down and assigned each soldier a score, predicting how well he would perform in officer training. The predictions came easily. They felt obvious. Certain soldiers had clearly demonstrated leadership qualities. Others clearly had not. They were wrong. Not slightly wrong, almost completely wrong. Every few months, the unit received feedback on how the cadets were actually performing in officer school. And every time, the story was the same. The predictions had almost no relationship to the outcomes. The soldiers who had looked like natural leaders on the obstacle field were no more likely to succeed than the ones who had seemed mediocre. Kahneman knew this. He saw the data with his own eyes. And here is the part that haunted him for decades. It made absolutely no difference. The next batch of candidates would arrive, and within minutes of watching them, he would feel the same vivid, certain impressions forming in his mind. He would see a natural leader. He would see a quitter, and his confidence would be just as high as before. He called this the illusion of validity. The impressions were so coherent, so immediate, so compelling that they felt like knowledge, but they were not knowledge. They were stories, beautifully constructed by System 1 from a tiny sample of behavior in an artificial situation, stories that had almost zero predictive power. Now here is the question that should make you uncomfortable. If a trained psychologist who is fully aware that his predictions are failing cannot stop himself from feeling confident about them, what chance do the rest of us have? Years later, Kahneman got the chance to test this question on Wall Street. He was invited to speak at a large wealth management firm that served extremely rich clients. Before his visit, he asked for data, specifically the annual performance results of 25 individual investment advisors over 8 consecutive years. The advisors were paid based on these results. The ones who made the most money for their clients received the biggest bonuses. The entire compensation system assumed that some advisors were more skilled than others, and that this skill persisted over time. Kahneman did something simple. He calculated the correlation between each advisor's rankings across every pair of years. Year 1 with year 2, year 1 with year 3, all the way through year 7 with year 8. 28 correlations in total. The average correlation was 0.01, effectively zero. There was no consistency whatsoever. An advisor who ranked near the top one year was equally likely to rank near the bottom the next. The year-to-year variation in their performance was indistinguishable from what you would expect if they were rolling dice. Kahneman presented these findings to the firm's executives. He told them, as gently as he could, that their bonus system was rewarding luck as if it were skill. Their reaction was polite, attentive, and then nothing changed. They went back to their offices, The bonuses continued to be paid. The advisors continued to believe they were talented. The executives continued to believe the system worked. On the drive to the airport afterward, one of the senior executives told Kahneman with just a trace of defensiveness, "I have done very well for the firm, and no one can take that away from me." Kahneman smiled and said nothing, but he thought, "I just took it away from you this morning. If your success was mostly luck, how much credit do you deserve? Is this problem limited to finance? Are stock pickers uniquely bad at predicting the future? Not even close." The psychologist Philip Tetlock spent 20 years collecting predictions from 284 people who made their living commenting on or advising about political and economic trends. Professors, government officials, think tank analysts, people whose professional identity is built on knowing what is going to happen next. He collected over 80,000 predictions. Then he waited to see who was right. The results were devastating. The experts performed worse than they would have if they had simply assigned equal probability to every possible outcome. In plain language, they would have been more accurate flipping a coin. And the most famous experts, the ones with the loudest opinions and the most television appearances, were the worst of all. Tetlock borrowed a metaphor from the philosopher Isaiah Berlin to describe two types of thinkers. Hedgehogs know one big thing. They have a grand theory that explains the world, and they apply it to everything. Foxes know many small things. They are comfortable with complexity, uncertainty, and the idea that multiple forces interact in unpredictable ways. The foxes did better. Not spectacularly better, but measurably so. The hedgehogs, the confident, eloquent, camera-ready experts who can explain everything with a single theory, performed worst of all. They were not just wrong, they were wrong and completely unable to admit it. When confronted with evidence that their predictions had failed, they had an endless supply of excuses. The timing was off. An unforeseeable event intervened. They were wrong, but for the right reasons. So if experts cannot be trusted, what can? Kahneman points to a deeply unsettling answer: formulas. In 1954, a young psychologist named Paul Meehl published what he later called My Disturbing Little Book. It reviewed 20 studies comparing two approaches to prediction. In one approach, trained human experts examined all available evidence, test scores, interviews, clinical impressions, and made a judgment. In the other, a simple formula combined a few numerical scores according to a fixed rule. The formula won. It won in predicting criminal recidivism. It won in predicting success in pilot training. It won in predicting college grades. It won in about 60% of the cases outright, and in the remaining 40% it tied. The experts never beat the formula, not once. The reasons are not hard to understand once you accept Kahneman's framework. Human experts are inconsistent. The same radiologist shown the same X-ray on 2 different days will contradict himself 20% of the time. The same auditor reviewing the same corporate records will reach different conclusions depending on whether it is Monday or Friday, whether she has eaten lunch, or whether the previous case happened to put her in a slightly different mood. Formulas do not have moods. They do not have Monday mornings. Given the same input, they always produce the same output. One of the most beautiful examples is the story of Virginia Apgar. Before 1953, when a baby was born with problems, the doctors and nurses in the delivery room relied on their clinical instincts to determine whether the infant was in danger. Different practitioners focused on different cues. Some watched for breathing, others listened for a cry. Critical warning signs were frequently missed, and many newborns died who could have been saved. Then one morning, over breakfast, a colleague asked Dr. Apgar how she would make a systematic assessment of a newborn. "That is easy," she said, and she jotted down 5 variables on a napkin: heart rate, respiration, reflex, muscle tone, and color, each scored from 0 to 2. A baby with a total score of 8 or above was likely doing fine. A baby scoring 4 or below needed immediate help. That napkin sketch became the APGAR score. It is still used today in every delivery room in the world, and it has been credited with saving hundreds of thousands of infant lives, not through some breakthrough in medical science, but by replacing the unreliable intuitions of tired humans with a simple, consistent checklist. But does all of this mean we should never trust expert intuition? That every gut feeling is garbage and only spreadsheets can save us? Kahneman does not go that far, and the reason is a fascinating collaboration with a psychologist named Gary Klein, who had spent his career studying expert intuition in firefighters, nurses, and military commanders. Klein and Kahneman disagreed about almost everything. Klein trusted intuition. Kahneman was skeptical. They agreed to work together and find the boundary. After years of debate, they reached a surprisingly simple conclusion. Expert intuition can be trusted when two conditions are met. First, the environment must be regular enough to be predictable. Chess, firefighting, and medical emergencies qualify, but stock markets and long-range political forecasting do not. Second, the expert must have had enough practice with rapid and clear feedback to learn the patterns in that environment. When both conditions are satisfied, the expert system 1 has genuinely learned something real, and its intuitions deserve respect. When either condition is absent, when the environment is chaotic, when feedback is slow or ambiguous, when the expert is operating outside the domain of her experience, confidence means nothing. The feeling of knowing is just a feeling. It is not knowledge. Chapter 3. The Planning Fallacy and the Outside View. A few years after his collaboration with Tversky began, Kahneman assembled a team to write a high school textbook on decision-making. The team included experienced teachers, psychology students, and a curriculum expert named Seymour Fox. They met every Friday afternoon. After about a year of productive work, they had a detailed outline, a couple of draft chapters, and a clear sense of momentum. One Friday, Kahneman asked everyone to write down an estimate of how long it would take to finish the textbook. He collected the slips. The answers clustered tightly around 2 years, ranging from about 18 months to 2.5 years. Then he had another idea. He turned to Seymour, the curriculum expert, and asked him a different kind of question. Can you think of other teams similar to ours who have tried to develop a curriculum from scratch? How did they do? Seymour went quiet. When he finally spoke, his voice was hesitant. You know, I never thought about this before, but not all teams at a stage like ours actually finished. A substantial fraction ended up failing entirely. Kahneman felt a chill. How large a fraction? About 40%. The room went silent. They had never considered the possibility that they might fail. Kahneman pressed further. And the teams that did finish, how long did it take them? Seymour did not hesitate this time. I cannot think of any that finished in less than 7 years, or any that took more than 10. There it was. The team had estimated 2 years. The real-world data said 7 to 10, with a 40% chance of never finishing at all. Kahneman then asked one more question, almost hoping for reassurance. How does our team compare to those others? How skilled are we relative to them? Seymour's answer was quietly devastating. Below average, but not by much. So what did the team do with this information? Did they revise their estimate? Did they consider quitting? They did neither. After a few minutes of uncomfortable silence, they gathered themselves and carried on as if nothing had happened. The textbook was eventually completed 8 years later. By that time, Kahneman had left the team and moved to another country. The curriculum, when it was finally delivered, was never used. This experience gave Kahneman 2 of his most important concepts. The first is the distinction between the inside view and the outside view. The inside view is what everyone on the team had used when they estimated 2 years. They looked at their specific situation, their specific plan, their specific progress, and projected forward. The outside view is what Seymour provided when Kahneman forced him to think about similar teams. It ignored the details of their particular project and looked at the statistical base rate of outcomes for projects like theirs. The inside view is the natural, default way humans think about the future. You examine the specifics of your situation, consider your plan, and imagine how things will unfold. It feels thorough and responsible, but it has a fatal weakness. It cannot account for what Donald Rumsfeld famously called the unknown unknowns. The divorces, the illnesses, the bureaucratic crises, the changes of heart that derail every long project in ways that no one can foresee at the outset. The outside view asks a fundamentally different question. Instead of how will our project go, it asks how have similar projects gone? And the answer is almost always more pessimistic and more accurate than the inside view. Is the curriculum story just an academic anecdote? Do these patterns show up in the real world at massive scale? In 1997, the proposed Scottish Parliament building was estimated to cost up to £40 million. By 2000, the cap had risen to £195 million. By 2002, it had passed £290 million. The building was finally completed in 2004 at a cost of roughly £431 million, more than 10 times the original estimate. A study of rail projects worldwide between 1969 and 1998 found that in more than 90% of cases, planners overestimated how many passengers would use the system. The average cost overrun was 45%. And here is the part that should alarm you. Despite decades of publicized failures, the forecasts did not get any better. Planners kept making the same mistakes because they kept using the inside view. American homeowners who remodel their kitchens expect to spend about $19,000. They actually spend about $39,000. The pattern is everywhere. Kahneman calls this the planning fallacy, and he sees it as one of the most pervasive and costly manifestations of optimistic bias. We make plans that are unrealistically close to best-case scenarios. We focus on what we intend to do and ignore the base rate of what actually happens to people who intend the same thing. And we do this not because we are foolish, but because the inside view is vivid, specific, and compelling, while the outside view is statistical, abstract, and easy to dismiss. The cure is simple to describe and difficult to practice. Whenever you are forecasting the outcome of a project, the time it will take, the money it will cost, the probability it will succeed, start with the outside view. Find similar projects, get the base rate, then adjust from there based on the specifics of your situation. This is what the Danish planning expert Bent Fleivberg calls reference class forecasting, and it is the single most effective technique for improving predictions. Kahneman also admires a simpler tool proposed by Gary Klein, the pre-mortem. Imagine you're on a team that has just settled on a plan. Before anyone commits, gather the group and say this: imagine that we are 1 year in the future. We implemented the plan exactly as it exists. The result was a disaster. Take 10 minutes and write a brief history of that disaster. What does this accomplish? 2 things. It gives people permission to voice doubts that group loyalty would normally suppress, and it channels the power of System 1, the same storytelling machinery that creates the planning fallacy, in the opposite direction. Instead of imagining success, the team is now imagining failure, and they are remarkably creative at it. The planning fallacy is not a minor error. It is the reason software projects come in late, wars last longer than anyone predicted, and entrepreneurs invest their life savings in businesses that have a 65% chance of failing within 5 years. The optimists who drive the economy forward are also the ones who build budgets that will be shattered, timelines that will be broken, and expectations that will end in disappointment. Understanding the planning fallacy will not make you a pessimist, but it might make you the kind of person who asks, before the first brick is laid, what the base rate of disaster actually looks like. So far, everything we have discussed in this half of the book has been about judgment, how we understand the past, how we predict the future, and why our confidence almost always exceeds our accuracy. But Kahneman's deepest contribution is not about judgment. It is about choice, and to understand it, we need to travel back to the 18th century, to a Swiss mathematician who made a brilliant discovery and a critical mistake that no one noticed for 250 years. Chapter 4. Prospect Theory. In 1738, a Swiss mathematician named Daniel Bernoulli published an essay that would shape economic thinking for the next 250 years. His insight was elegant and intuitive. People do not evaluate money by its absolute amount. They evaluate it by its psychological impact, and the psychological impact of gaining money diminishes as you get richer. The difference between having nothing and having $100,000 is enormous. The difference between having 900,000 and having $1 million is barely noticeable. This idea that the psychological value of wealth follows a curve of diminishing returns became the foundation of utility theory. It explained why people buy insurance. It explained why people avoid risky bets, even when the expected value is in their favor. And for over 2 centuries, no one seriously questioned it. Then Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky looked at it and saw a flaw so fundamental, so obvious in retrospect, that Kahneman still marvels at how it was missed for so long. Here is the flaw, illustrated by a simple story. Imagine 2 people, Jack and Jill. Today, Jack has $5 million. Yesterday, he had $1 million. Today, Jill also has $5 million. Yesterday, she had $9 million. Are they equally happy? According to Bernoulli's theory, they should be. They have the same wealth. The theory says that happiness is determined by where you are, not where you came from. But of course, they are not equally happy. Jack is euphoric. Jill is devastated. And you knew this instantly because your own System 1 evaluates the world exactly the way Kahneman describes, not in terms of absolute states, but in terms of changes from a reference point. This is the central discovery of prospect theory, the work that earned Kahneman the Nobel Prize. Bernoulli was wrong. The carriers of psychological value are not states of wealth. They are gains and losses relative to a reference point. And this single correction changes everything. Once you accept that people think in terms of gains and losses rather than final states, 3 principles emerge, and they explain an extraordinary range of human behavior. The first is reference dependence. Your satisfaction with any outcome depends on what you compare it to. A salary of $90,000 feels wonderful if you were making $60,000 last year, and miserable if you were making $120,000. The salary is identical. The experience is not. The second is diminishing sensitivity. The jump from nothing to $100 feels large. The jump from $900 to $1,000 feels small. This works for losses too. Losing the first $100 hurts terribly, but once you have already lost $900, losing another $100 barely registers. Your emotional response flattens out as the amounts get larger. And the third principle, the one that matters most, is loss aversion. Kahneman puts it this way. Imagine I offer you a simple bet. We flip a coin. If it comes up heads, you win $150. If it comes up tails, you lose $100. This is an objectively good bet. The expected value is positive. Over many flips, you would come out well ahead, but most people reject it. The possibility of losing $100 is more painful than the prospect of gaining $150 as attractive. The loss looms larger than the gain. How much larger? Kahneman and Tversky measured it across dozens of experiments. The ratio is remarkably stable. For most people, losses hurt approximately twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. You need to stand to win roughly $200 before you would accept a 50-50 chance of losing $100. This is not a minor quirk. Loss aversion is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, and its fingerprints are on nearly every consequential decision you make. Consider one of the simplest and most striking demonstrations. Researchers at Cornell University gave coffee mugs to half the students in a classroom. The mugs were ordinary. decorated with the university logo, worth about $6. The students who received mugs were asked the lowest price at which they would sell. The students who did not receive mugs were asked the most they would pay to buy one. Economic theory says these numbers should be roughly equal. A mug is a mug. Its value does not change depending on whether you happen to own it right now, but the selling price averaged about $7. The buying price averaged about $3. The students who owned the mugs valued them at more than double what the non-owners would pay. Owning the mug, holding it, seeing it on the desk in front of them for a few minutes, had transformed its psychological value. Kahneman calls this the endowment effect. Once you possess something, giving it up feels like a loss, and because losses are weighted about twice as heavily as gains, you demand much more to part with a thing than you would pay to acquire it. This is true for coffee mugs, for concert tickets, for houses, for jobs, and for ideas. We cling to what we have not because it is objectively valuable, but because letting go is painful. Think about the implications. Loss aversion explains why people stay in jobs they dislike. The fear of losing the familiar outweighs the potential gain of something better. It explains why negotiations so often stall. Every concession feels like a wound, and the concessions made by the other side feel like inadequate compensation. It explains why reforms that would benefit almost everyone are blocked by the few who stand to lose. The losers fight with an intensity that the winners cannot match because losses burn hotter than gains glow. But loss aversion is only one piece of the puzzle Kahneman and Tversky assembled. The full picture, what they called prospect theory, also includes a set of discoveries about how we handle probability that are just as counterintuitive and just as consequential. And those discoveries lead directly into one of the most unsettling findings in the book: the ease with which your preferences can be reversed by something as trivial as the way a question is worded. Chapter 5. Framing, Mental Accounting, and the Fourfold Pattern. Imagine that the United States is preparing for the outbreak of an unusual disease that is expected to kill 600 people. Two programs have been proposed. If Program A is adopted, 200 people will be saved. If Program B is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, and a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. When Kahneman and Tversky presented this version, 72% of people chose Program A, the sure thing, save 200 people for certain, rather than gamble with all 600 lives. This is classic risk aversion in the domain of gains. A guaranteed positive outcome feels safer and more attractive than a gamble with the same expected value. Now consider a different group of people, presented with the same disease and the same 600 lives at stake, but with the programs described differently. If Program C is adopted, 400 people will die. If Program D is adopted, there is a 1/3 probability that nobody will die, and a 2/3 probability that 600 people will die. In this version, 78% chose Program D, the gamble. They preferred to roll the dice rather than accept the certainty that 400 people would die. Here is the devastating fact. Programs A and C are identical. 200 saved out of 600 means 400 die. Programs B and D are identical too. The outcomes are the same. The probabilities are the same. The only thing that changed was the words. In the first version, the sure option was described as saving lives. Again, people were risk averse. In the second version, the same sure option was described as saving lives. A loss. A loss. People became risk-seeking. The same human lives. The same medical reality. Completely opposite preferences, driven entirely by whether the frame emphasized what would be preserved or what would be destroyed. Kahneman calls these framing effects, and they are among the most disturbing findings in all of decision science, because they reveal something uncomfortable. In many situations, you do not have a stable preference at all. You have a preference that depends on how the question is asked. And since you are almost never shown both frames, you have no way of knowing that your choice might flip if someone rephrased the question. Are trained professionals immune to this? Kahneman's colleague Amos Tversky tested this on physicians, people who make life and death decisions every day. They were given real statistics about 2 lung cancer treatments, surgery and radiation. Surgery has better long-term survival but carries a higher risk of dying during the procedure itself. Half the physicians saw the short-term results framed in terms of survival rates. The other half saw the same numbers framed in terms of mortality rates. When told that the 1-month survival rate for surgery was 90%, 84% of physicians chose surgery. When told that there was 10% mortality in the first month, only 50% chose surgery. Same procedure, same data, same doctors. A change of 3 words, from survival to mortality, shifted a third of them to a different treatment recommendation. Framing effects extend deep into public policy. One of the most striking examples involves organ donation. In countries where citizens must check a box to become an organ donor, an opt-in system, donation rates hover around 4 to 12%. In countries where citizens are automatically registered as donors, unless they check a box to opt out, rates approach 100%. The difference is not that the citizens of Austria love donating organs while the citizens of Germany do not. The difference is that checking a box requires effort and System 2 is lazy. Whatever the default option is, that is what most people will accept. An organ donation policy that could save thousands of lives turns on nothing more than whether the form asks you to opt in or opt out. Framing effects work because of the S-shaped value function at the heart of prospect theory. Gains and losses are evaluated differently. A sure gain feels safe and attractive. A sure loss feels painful and intolerable. And this asymmetry produces what Kahneman calls the fourfold pattern, a map of how people actually behave when facing different combinations of probability and outcome. In the upper left of the pattern, you have a high probability of a large gain. Most people are risk-averse here. They take the sure thing. This is why plaintiffs with strong cases tend to accept settlements rather than gamble on a trial they will probably win. In the upper right, a high probability of a large loss. Most people become risk-seeking. They gamble rather than accept the sure loss. This is why defendants who are likely to lose prefer to go to trial. It is also why failing businesses throw good money after bad, hoping for a miracle rather than accepting a painful but certain defeat. The bottom of the pattern is where things get especially interesting. In the lower left, a small probability of a large gain, people become risk-seeking. This is the lottery ticket. The chance of winning is negligible, but the possibility is so vivid, so emotionally charged, that people pay far more than the expected value for a ticket. And in the lower right, a small probability of a large loss, people become risk-averse. This is insurance. The chance of your house burning down is tiny, but the image is terrifying, and you willingly pay a premium that far exceeds the expected loss to make the fear go away. The fourfold pattern explains why the same person can buy both a lottery ticket and an insurance policy on the same day without seeing any contradiction. The lottery appeals to the possibility effect, overweighting tiny chances of large gains. The insurance appeals to the certainty effect, the desperate need to eliminate even a small chance of catastrophe. Neither decision is rational in the strict economic sense. Both are perfectly natural given the way your mind processes probability. Kahneman and his collaborator Richard Thaler explored another dimension of this irrationality, the strange ways we categorize and track our money. Thaler called it mental accounting, and one experiment captures the idea perfectly. Imagine you arrive at a theater and discover you have lost your ticket, which cost $10. Would you buy another one? Now imagine a different scenario. You arrive at the theater planning to buy a ticket and discover you have lost a $10 bill from your wallet. Would you still buy the ticket? The financial situation is identical. You are $10 poorer either way, but most people who lose the ticket refuse to buy another one. while most people who lose the cash happily buy a ticket anyway. Why? Because of mental accounting. Losing the ticket is posted to the theater account in your mind. Buying a second ticket doubles the cost of seeing the show, which feels unacceptable. Losing $10 in cash is posted to a general money account. It makes you slightly poorer overall, but does not affect the cost of the show. The categories in your head determine how the loss feels, even when the objective reality is identical. Mental accounting is harmless when the stakes are small, but it becomes destructive in larger decisions. Investors hold on to losing stocks because selling would close a mental account at a loss, a painful act that feels like admitting defeat. They sell winners too early because closing an account with a gain feels satisfying, even when the smart move is to let the winner ride and cut the loser. This pattern, called the disposition effect, costs individual investors billions of dollars every year. The same logic drives the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to keep investing in a failing project because so much has already been spent. A company that has poured $50 million into a product that is clearly failing will often spend another $60 million rather than admit the first investment was wasted. The rational move is to ignore the sunk cost and evaluate only the future prospects. But closing that mental account with a massive loss is so painful that System 1 would rather keep gambling. Prospect theory, framing effects, mental accounting, the fourfold pattern, taken together, they paint a picture of human decision-making that is radically different from what economists had assumed for 2 centuries. We are not rational calculators who evaluate outcomes by their absolute value and weight them by their true probability. We are reference-dependent, loss-averse, frame-sensitive creatures whose choices can be reversed by a change of wording and whose financial behavior is governed by mental categories that have no basis in economic reality. And yet Kahneman was not finished. He had one more discovery to share, perhaps the most personal and the most unsettling of all. A discovery about what happens when you turn this same lens inward and ask the simplest possible question about your own life. Are you happy? Chapter 6. The Two Selves. A man once approached Kahneman after a lecture and told him a story. He had been listening to a long and beautiful symphony, a recording he loved deeply. For nearly 40 minutes, the music was extraordinary. Then, near the end, a scratch on the disc produced a horrible, jarring screech. The man said the bad ending ruined the whole experience. Kahneman paused on that phrase, ruin the whole experience. Because if you think about it carefully, that is not what happened. The experience was not ruined. The experience was 40 minutes of bliss, followed by a few seconds of unpleasantness. Those 40 minutes of pleasure actually occurred. They happened inside the man's consciousness. They were real. The scratch at the end could not reach backward through time and undo them. What was ruined was not the experience. What was ruined was the memory. And this distinction, the difference between what you actually experience as you live your life and what you remember afterward, turns out to be one of the deepest and most consequential ideas in Kahneman's entire body of work. He proposes that there are 2 selves inside each of us. The experiencing self is the one who lives your life moment by moment. It feels the warmth of the sun right now. It notices whether you are bored or engaged right now. It is the one who actually endures a painful medical procedure or enjoys a beautiful vacation. The experiencing self exists only in the present. The remembering self is the one who keeps score afterward. It constructs the story of what happened. It assigns a rating to the experience. And crucially, it is the one who makes decisions about the future, because when you choose between a vacation in the mountains or at the beach, you are choosing based on memories and anticipated memories, not based on a moment-by-moment forecast of how each day will actually feel. The problem, and it is a profound problem, is that the remembering self is a terrible reporter. It follows rules that systematically distort its account of what the experiencing self actually went through. Kahneman discovered these rules through an experiment involving colonoscopy patients. In the early 1990s, before sedation became routine for the procedure, patients experienced real and significant pain. During the examination, they reported their pain level every 60 seconds on a scale from 0 to 10. This gave Kahneman a continuous, moment-by-moment record of what the experiencing self actually endured. After the procedure, each patient was asked to rate the total amount of pain they experienced. If the remembering self were an accurate reporter, you would expect the overall rating to reflect the total pain, a kind of sum of all the bad moments. A longer procedure with more pain at every point should receive a worse rating than a shorter one. That is not what happened. The retrospective ratings were governed by two factors, and only two factors. The first was the intensity of pain at the worst moment, the peak. The second was the intensity of pain at the very end. Kahneman calls this the peak end rule. And there was a stunning omission. The duration of the procedure had virtually no effect on the remembered pain. A 24-minute colonoscopy and an 8-minute one could receive identical ratings if their peak and endpoint were similar. Now consider two specific patients from the study. Patient A endured 8 minutes of moderate pain that spiked sharply right at the end. Patient B endured 24 minutes, at least as much pain as patient A at every point, and often more. But the final minutes were milder, tapering gently before the procedure ended. Which patient suffered more? By any objective measure, patient B. More pain at every point, 3 times as long, more total suffering by a wide margin. But which patient had the worst memory? Patient A, because his procedure ended at a peak of agony, while patient B's faded gently. The peak was the same, but the ending was different, and the ending dominated the memory. Kahneman calls this duration neglect, and it operates far beyond the medical setting. We judge vacations not by how many good days we had, but by how the trip peaked and how it ended. We judge relationships not by the years of companionship, but by the worst moments and the final chapter. A marriage that was happy for 20 years but ended in a bitter divorce is remembered as an unhappy marriage, even though the experiencing self spent 2 decades in a state that was, most of the time, genuinely good. This is why the last 10 minutes of La Traviata matter so much. The opera tells the story of 2 lovers separated by circumstance. In the final act, the heroine lies dying. Her beloved races to reach her. The audience holds its breath. Will he arrive in time? He does. They sing together for a few glorious minutes, and then she dies. Kahneman thought about this carefully. He did not care whether Violetta lived to 27 or 28. An extra year of life made no emotional difference to him as a listener. But if the lover had arrived 10 minutes too late, if the ending had been missed, the entire opera would have felt like a different and far more devastating experience. The story, the memory, the evaluation, everything depends on the ending, and almost nothing depends on the duration. This is the tyranny of the remembering self. It composes stories and it keeps score, and the rules it uses for scoring are deeply unfair to the experiencing self, which actually did the living. Duration, which should matter enormously, is ignored. Peaks and endings, which are just 2 moments out of thousands, dominate the record. Kahneman designed an experiment to show this conflict at its sharpest. Subjects placed one hand in painfully cold water, 14 degrees Celsius, for 60 seconds, then removed it and received a warm towel. This was the short trial. In the long trial, they kept their hand in the same painfully cold water for 60 seconds, and then, without being told, the temperature rose by a single degree over the next 30 seconds. Still painful, but slightly less so. 7 minutes later, they were told they would repeat one of the 2 trials and were asked to choose which one. Think about this from the perspective of the experiencing self. The long trial contains every second of pain from the short trial plus 30 additional seconds of pain. There is no rational reason to prefer it. It is strictly worse. 80% of subjects chose the long trial. They voluntarily chose more pain because the slight improvement at the end had created a less unpleasant memory. The remembering self preferred the episode with the better ending, and the experiencing self was dragged along for 30 extra seconds of suffering. This is not a minor laboratory curiosity. It reveals something fundamental about how human beings navigate their lives. We do not choose the experiences that will make us happiest while we are living them. We choose the experiences that will leave the best memories, and the memories are written by a self that does not care about duration, that obsesses over peaks and endings, and that often makes choices the experiencing self would never endorse. So if the remembering self is making the choices, and its choices are often at odds with actual experience, what does that mean for the biggest question of all? What does it actually mean to be happy? Chapter 7. What actually makes us happy? A few years ago, a massive analysis of more than 450,000 responses to the Gallup Well-Being Index tried to answer a question that people have debated for centuries. Can money buy happiness? The answer turns out to be surprisingly precise, and it depends entirely on what you mean by happiness. Kahneman and his colleague Angus Deaton found that there are two completely different things hiding inside that word. The first is experienced well-being, how you actually feel as you go through your day. Are you smiling? Are you stressed? Are you enjoying the person you are with? The second is life satisfaction, the judgment you make when someone asks you to step back and evaluate your life as a whole. Money affects these two measures very differently. For experienced well-being, the day-to-day quality of your emotional life, income matters a great deal when you do not have much of it. Being poor is genuinely miserable. It amplifies every other source of suffering. A headache, a divorce, a bout of loneliness, all of these hurt more when you are struggling financially. Every dollar that lifts you out of poverty produces a real and measurable improvement in how your days feel. But this effect has a ceiling. In their data, the point at which additional income stopped improving day-to-day emotional experience was a household income of about $75,000 in high-cost areas, adjusted for the time of the study. Beyond that threshold, people who earned more did not report feeling happier on a typical day. They were not more joyful, not more amused, not less stressed, not less sad, but life satisfaction, the answer to how do you rate your life on a scale from 0 to 10, kept climbing with income well beyond the $75,000 mark. Richer people were more satisfied with their lives even when they were not having a better time living them. How is that possible? How can you rate your life higher without actually enjoying it more? The answer lies in the focusing illusion, an idea that Kahneman considers one of the most important in the psychology of well-being. He summarizes it in a single sentence that I think is worth committing to memory. Nothing in life is as important as you think it is when you are thinking about it. When someone asks how satisfied you are with your life, you do not conduct an exhaustive review of every domain of your existence. You cannot. The question hits you and your system 1 grabs the most salient information available. Your mood, a recent event, whatever aspect of your life comes to mind first, and substitutes it for the impossibly complex assessment you were actually asked to make. Kahneman and a colleague tested this by asking students at universities in California and in the Midwest 2 questions. How satisfied are you with your life? And how satisfied are you with the climate where you live? The results were simple and devastating. There was no difference in overall life satisfaction between the Californians and the Midwesterners. None at all, but both groups believed that Californians were happier. And the reason was transparent. When people thought about living in California, they thought about the weather. The weather is wonderful, therefore Californians must be happy. But people in California do not spend their days thinking about the weather. They think about traffic and deadlines and relationships and what to have for dinner. The same things everyone else thinks about. The weather is lovely, but it is only salient when you focus on it. The rest of the time, it is invisible, and it contributes almost nothing to how your day actually feels. The focusing illusion explains why people consistently overestimate the impact of major life changes, both positive and negative. You think a bigger house will make you happier, but within months you will stop noticing the extra space. You think a promotion will transform your life, but the daily experience of your new role will quickly become routine. You think becoming a paraplegic would make life unbearable, but research shows that paraplegics report being in a good mood more than half the time, because most of the time they are not thinking about their disability. They are watching a movie, talking to a friend, reading the news, getting irritated by politics. The same things everyone does. The same illusion works in reverse. We underestimate the impact of activities that reliably capture our attention. Things that are pleasant or unpleasant every single time we do them. Spending time with close friends, a long commute, chronic pain, good sex. These activities cannot fade into the background because by their nature, they demand your presence. Kahneman's data suggests that one of the most effective ways to improve your actual experienced happiness is deceptively simple. Spend less time doing things you find unpleasant and more time with people you love. But here is the complication. We do not optimize for experienced happiness. We optimize for the story. Kahneman asks a thought experiment that I find genuinely haunting. Imagine you are planning a vacation. Now imagine that at the end of the vacation, all your photographs will be destroyed, and you will take a pill that erases all memory of the trip. The vacation will be enjoyed only while it is happening. Would you still go? Would you go to the same place? Would you spend the same amount of money? Most people, when they sit with this question honestly, admit that the prospect of a vacation with no memory changes everything. Some say they would not bother going at all. Others say they would choose a completely different kind of trip, something restful and pleasant, rather than adventurous and memorable. This is a confession that the remembering self is in charge. We do not plan vacations to maximize the quality of our experience. We plan them to maximize the quality of our memories. The frenetic photograph taking of tourists is not an interruption of the experience. It is the point. We are constructing future memories while the present experience passes by, often unnoticed. Kahneman also discovered something that surprised him about the relationship between life circumstances and day-to-day happiness. Using a method he developed called the day reconstruction method, he asked women to reconstruct their previous day in detail. Every episode, every activity, every companion, and rate their feelings during each one. One of the findings was quietly explosive. On average, women who lived with a romantic partner were not happier during their days than women who lived alone. Not because marriage is meaningless, but because life with a partner involves a complicated trade. You spend less time alone, which is good, but you also spend much less time with friends, which is costly. You spend more time in intimate moments, which is wonderful, but you also spend much more time doing housework, preparing meals, and caring for children, activities that consistently rank among the least pleasant things people do. The net result is approximately zero. The experienced well-being of partnered and unpartnered women was indistinguishable, and yet, if you asked those same women to evaluate their lives, the partnered women rated their satisfaction higher. The remembering self valued the relationship. The experiencing self was having roughly the same kind of day regardless. Kahneman eventually concluded that neither the experiencing self nor the remembering self can be ignored. A theory of well-being that only counts the experiencing self misses the fact that people care deeply about their life story, about whether it has meaning, direction, and a satisfying narrative arc. But a theory that only counts the remembering self misses the fact that most of life is lived in the present, and the quality of that present experience matters enormously, even when it is not remembered. The two selves are in tension, and there is no clean resolution. You cannot always choose the option that makes the best memory and the best experience simultaneously. Sometimes you must choose between a comfortable life and a meaningful one, between a pleasant afternoon and a story worth telling, between the self who lives and the self who remembers, and recognizing that this tension exists, that you are not one self with one clear set of desires, but two selves with different priorities and different accounting systems, is perhaps the most profound insight in a book that is full of them. Key takeaways: what this book is really about. We have now traveled through the entire arc of thinking, fast and slow, from the two systems in your head to the two selves competing for control of your happiness. That is a lot of ground. So let me step back from the individual biases and experiments and ask a larger question. What is this book actually trying to tell us? I think the deepest message is not about any single bias. It is not about anchoring or availability or loss aversion in isolation. It is about the gap between the world as it is and the world as your mind presents it to you. Your mind shows you a world that is more orderly than the real one, more predictable, more knowable. A world where success is earned and failure is deserved, where the past was inevitable and the future can be foreseen, where the story always makes sense. Kahneman spent his career measuring the distance between that comforting illusion and the messy, random, probabilistic reality underneath it. From part 1, the heuristics and biases, the lesson is that your automatic mind takes shortcuts that feel like wisdom. It answers easy questions instead of hard ones. It sees patterns in randomness. It ignores what it does not know and builds confident stories from fragments. These shortcuts work most of the time, which is why evolution kept them. But in the moments that matter most, the big financial decision, the important hire, the medical choice, the judgment of risk, they fail in predictable ways, and your conscious mind, the one that could catch the errors, is too lazy to do its job unless you deliberately wake it up. From part 2, overconfidence, prospect theory, and the two selves, the lessons cut even deeper. Your confidence in your own predictions is almost always too high. The experts you trust are barely better than chance in most domains. Your choices about risk are systematically warped by whether the situation is framed as a gain or a loss. Losing hurts twice as much as winning feels good, and this invisible asymmetry shapes everything from your investment strategy to your willingness to accept a new job, to whether you leave a relationship that is no longer working. And at the end of it all, the self who evaluates your life is not the same self who lived it, and the evaluator's scoring system is deeply flawed. So what do you do with all of this? How do you live in a world where your own mind is unreliable? Kahneman's answer is not what most self-help books would give you. He does not tell you to think positive. He does not offer 5 steps to perfect rationality. After a lifetime of studying cognitive errors, he freely admits that his own thinking is just as biased as the day he started. He still feels the pull of anchors. He still creates narrative explanations for random events. He still confuses the stories of his remembering self with the actual experiences of his life. What he has gained is not immunity, it is recognition. He has learned to notice when he is in a cognitive minefield, when the conditions are ripe for a particular kind of error. And that recognition, even without a cure, is enormously valuable. Here is what that looks like in practice. When you are about to make a major prediction about a project's timeline, a business's prospects, your own future happiness, pause and look for the outside view. What happened to other people who were in this situation? What is the base rate? Your inside view will feel more vivid and more relevant, but it is almost certainly too optimistic. When you feel absolutely certain about something, when the story in your head is clean, coherent, and leaves no room for doubt, treat that certainty as a warning, not a reassurance. The cleaner the story feels, the more likely it is that you are ignoring information that does not fit. Ask yourself what you are not seeing. Ask yourself what would have to be true for you to be wrong. When you face a decision involving risk, pay attention to the frame. Are you thinking about this as a potential gain or a potential loss? Would your preference change if someone rephrased the question? If it would, then your preference is not really about the substance. It is about the words. Reframe the problem yourself before you commit. When you are tempted to hold on to something, a stock, a job, a belief, a relationship, simply because letting go feels painful, recognize that loss aversion may be making the decision for you. Ask yourself honestly, if I did not already have this, would I choose to acquire it at its current cost? If the answer is no, then the only thing keeping you is the pain of giving it up. And when you evaluate your own happiness, when you step back and ask whether your life is going well, remember that the answer depends on which self you ask. The remembering self will focus on peaks, endings, and milestones. The experiencing self lives in the ordinary moments between the milestones. A life that looks impressive in retrospect may have felt exhausting and joyless to live. A life that looks unremarkable may have been quietly full of warmth and pleasure and presence. Neither self has the complete picture. Neither should be trusted absolutely, but recognizing that they exist, that the tension between them is real and permanent, gives you something most people never have: a choice. Not a choice between the selves, but an awareness that allows you to listen to both of them before deciding which one to follow in any given moment. Kahneman closes his book by saying that we cannot hope to eliminate the biases of System 1. They are too fast, too automatic, too deeply woven into the architecture of the brain. But we can hope to recognize the situations where those biases are most dangerous. We can build organizations and procedures that compensate for them. We can develop a vocabulary that makes it easier to talk about them with the people around us. And we can approach our own minds with the same respectful skepticism that a good scientist brings to any unreliable instrument, not dismissing it, not ignoring it, but never quite trusting it completely. We started this journey in part 1 with a bat and a ball, a simple math problem with an answer that felt so right, so obvious, that you did not think to check it. And we end here in part 2 with a $20 bill found in a pocket, and the strange, unequal weight of gaining and losing the same small thing. Between those two moments, Kahneman walked us through a portrait of the human mind that is unlike anything most of us have encountered. It is not a flattering portrait, but it is not a cruel one either. Kahneman does not look down on the people who fall for these illusions. He falls for them himself. He is describing the human condition with the precision of a scientist and the compassion of someone who knows he is as human as anyone. The real gift of this book is not a set of tricks for making better decisions, although you will make better decisions if you absorb its lessons. The real gift is a kind of humility, an earned, specific, useful humility about the machinery between your ears. Your mind is the most remarkable instrument you will ever use. It is also an instrument that distorts the signal even as it receives it, and knowing that, truly knowing it, not as an abstract fact, but as a felt reality, changes how you move through the world. You will still have intuitions. You will still feel certain. You will still tell yourself stories about the past that make everything seem inevitable, and stories about the future that make your plans seem solid. You will still feel the sting of losses more sharply than the glow of gains. You will still judge your life by its peaks and its endings rather than by its ordinary, quiet, uncounted middle. But now at least you know why. And on the days when the stakes are high and the margins are thin, that knowledge might be the difference between a choice you regret and one you can live with. Here is my question for you. Across both parts of this deep dive, from System 1 and System 2 to prospect theory and the two selves, which single idea hit you the hardest? Not the one you found most intellectually interesting, but the one that made you think of something specific in your own life. a decision you made, a judgment you trusted, a moment where, looking back, you can now see the invisible hand of one of these biases shaping what you did. I would love to hear about it in the comments. The more specific, the more honest, the better. Those are the stories that make this material real. If this book resonated with you, and I suspect it did if you made it through both parts, I cannot recommend strongly enough that you read Thinking Fast and Slow yourself. What we covered in these 2 videos is the skeleton of the book. The flesh is in the dozens of additional experiments, the personal stories, the philosophical reflections, and the experience of participating in the demonstrations yourself as you read. There is a link to the book on Amazon and Audible in the description below. It is a book you will return to again and again, because every time you reread a chapter, you notice a bias you missed the first time, operating, as always, right under your nose. If this is your first time here, this channel is called One Book Away. We take the most transformative books ever written and walk through every key idea with depth, with honesty, and with the belief that a single book, fully understood, can change the direction of a life. If that idea resonates with you, subscribe. There is much more to come. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next one.